Uh, okay, I wanted to thank everybody for being here. At what promises, I think, to be a very interesting panel. We have two speakers and a discussant. So let me introduce each person and then give a bit of an overview about what this seminar is about. So Shehryar Banoori, we're very lucky to have him. He's a development economist who's currently based at the University of East Anglia, and he does a lot of experimental work. And his recent work is about beliefs, ideologies, and decision-making processes of public sector servants. Asad Liaquat is a PhD student at Harvard Kennedy School. He does a lot of work on political economy, but he's also been involved in doing some work about how civil servants make evidence-based decisions. And as our discussant, we have Silvan Sadiq Saab, who needs no introduction. He is Chief Secretary Punjab at a time when Punjab was growing really fast, and then he was also Federal Finance Secretary, and he's been a civil servant with years and years of experience, so it'd be lovely to hear his thoughts on what the findings are that are going to be presented by Shehryar and Asad. So the kind of bigger overview, and I'll just take a minute over it and then hand it to Shehryar first, and then Asad, and then we'll ask Salman Saab to make his comments and then open it up. But there's kind of this buzzword called evidence-based policymaking, right? And there is this movement more and more towards pushing for evidence-based, mainstreaming of evidence in policy decision-making. But nobody has really unpacked the question of how do civil servants actually process evidence? And how do they read evidence? Do they read it objectively? Do they have ideologies and biases which taint how they make inferences? So the two studies that are going to be presented today give us microeconomic insights into these questions. And with that, I'll hand it over to Shehryar to go first, and then we'll go to Asad.
Sorry, I am comfortable standing, so I hope you don't mind. I'm going to stand and move around, block your view from time to time. I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
Oh, I see. All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's my pleasure and honor to be here and present some of this work, which I think is particularly. You like to? All right. So present this work, which I think is pretty important and gives us some sort of, I don't know if I'll be bold, I'll say new insights into this issue of decision making in the public sector. Okay, let me first start by telling you a story that happened very recently. This is Paul Romer. You guys have heard of Paul Romer, if not seen him. Paul Romer, until very recently, was the chief economist at the World Bank. He is very well known for the Romer model, very influential model in the 80s of exogenous growth. Brilliant man. People often keep asking why he hasn't received a Nobel Prize yet. Paul is also something a little bit more personal and interesting about him. He's also practices martial arts. Did you know that? Yeah. We'll see him in action in a little bit. Can I go to the next? Recently, though, Paul got in trouble. Yeah. Paul was talking to some journalists, and he mentioned that the famous Doing Business report at the World Bank had some difficulties or some anomalies, and he would like to apologize to Chile in particular, okay? The Chilean government. Now, that comment got him under a lot of trouble at the bank, right? There's a new story about this, about how maybe the World Bank is influencing its own competitive rankings to the detriment of people based on ideology or some things like that. Now, of course, that got Paul pretty defensive, yeah? And so you saw, here's his martial arts skills, yeah? This is just me being mean. Can we just go next? Here's actually what happened with Chile, okay? This is a graph that's generated by Justin Sandefur, right? Who's very well known to address these sorts of issues. The orange lines is what I would like you to focus on first. These orange lines are the ranking for Chile in the Doing Business report, right? Higher rankings mean better, right? And lower rankings mean worse. During Michel Bachelet's presidency, then during Sebastián Piñera's presidency, and then again during Michel Bachelet. Now, Bachelet and Piñera are very different in terms of ideology. Michel is part of the Socialist Party. Yeah? Sebastian is not. Okay? And so what you can see here in these orange lines in the published Doing Business rankings, steep declines during socialist governments, right? And recoveries during a non-socialist government. Right? Now, the Doing Business report is also known for changing methodologies over time. So what Justin did was he took one standard methodology used at the beginning, right, and just carried it all the way through. So he recalculates numbers using one fixed methodology and one set of countries. That's the blue line right there. So what you see here is, of course, a pretty different picture of Chile. This is the sort of thing that Paul was actually talking about. Yeah? Now, of course, at the back of this, once this got into press, Paul actually said that he was quoted out of context. He was also recently let go from his position. It's not clear whether it's because of this or not. Okay? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So here's Paul looking a little bit sad. Yeah. Next slide. It's not just Chile, though. Justin went ahead and did this same exercise for a lot of different countries. Here's a graph for India and a recent speech made by Modi heralding about how his government improved the Doing Business rankings, India's standings in the Doing Business rankings, right? And Justin says it's actually because of methodology, not because of any policy reasons, based on this graph. Now, it's not Paul Romer that's the issue here. That's the thing I want to make clear. That's an interesting story, but it's not the real problem. Okay? The real problem is that this has been going on for 8-10 years, not this in particular, but methodological changes and so on. And a lot of times, if data goes against what we believe, right, we have a hard time believing that data. Yeah? That's the key that I want to bring forward. Now, for the public sector, this is extremely critical, because the public sector, you have people that are actually contractually obligated to evaluate data objectively, right? And you can actually see that in the UK civil service, one of the places where we conducted our study, they're contractually obligated to uphold core values of integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality, right? And in particular, objectivity is basing your advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of the evidence. The other sample that I bring to you today is from the World Bank. Right? The World Bank has an entire group dedicated to doing exactly that, the independent evaluation. Right? The goal of them, or evaluation, is to provide impartial, evidence-based assessments. So we're interested on the other side of the coin. In academic circles, we know that there's a large literature in psychology about biases, right? And how biases color our decisions. So what we're interested in is whether policy professionals, right? In this case, World Bank and DFID people who are legally required to make decisions in an objective manner, whether they actually do. Using a series of, if you permit me to say it, rather cute experiments. And I'm going to show you what those look like. Okay, So we're conducting this study. This study was conducted back in 2014-15. It's a representative sample of World Bank and DFID professionals, and it's a rather large sample. And basically, we're using surveys with built-in randomization. Okay? I'm going to present two results, or two experiments in particular, right? And I hope to show you or demonstrate that these biases not only persist, but they can be pretty dangerous. Okay, so the first bias I'm going to talk about is confirmation bias in the context of anti-poverty, which is a big deal certainly for the World Bank, but also for DFID, right? Confirmation bias is very dangerous, especially for us that are in policy and intelligentsia based. The reason is that confirmation bias is a bias that arises out of selectively seeking out information that confirms your priors. Right? So if I have a certain belief, I will look for evidence to confirm that belief. And I might even reject evidence that goes against that belief. Yeah? So that's particularly dangerous. Yeah? So that's what we're going to focus on first. This is how we did the experiment. Okay? I'd like you to just take a second and evaluate this. Right? So this is what we told people. Look, researchers are interested in the effect of a skin cream on rashes. Yeah? And so they gave the skin cream to a bunch of people, and they also got data from a bunch of people who didn't get the skin cream. Okay? For some of them, the rash got worse. For some of them, the rash got better. Okay? Now, I'm just giving you this table and saying, tell me whether patients who used the skin cream, whether the skin cream was effective, right? Whether the rash got better. That's all I'm saying with this data. Okay? Now, these numbers, if you have the idea in your head, I'm not going to ask for hands, right? Just keep that idea in your head. These numbers are set up in a very particular way, so we're being very sneaky. Yeah? The first thing is, you can use one of two heuristics, or you can engage in the actual calculation. If you use heuristics, you'll compare either this number to this number, and you'll say the rash got worse. Or you'll compare this number to this number, and you'll say the rash got worse. But it's a frequency table. So the right way to calculate this is to take this number divided by the total, take this number divided by the total, compare that proportion, and that will give you the answer, which is that the rash actually got better. Yeah? So we implemented this to a bunch of World Bank and DFID colleagues, and here's what the answer they gave. About 72% of our sample got the answer right. Okay? That's pretty high. These are highfalutin people, right? So yes, they're good at math. It's better than chance, right? Because it could either be, 50% if you're just doing it randomly. Okay, then what we did was for a separate group of people, we gave them the same numbers, notice, but I changed this label. Yeah? And what that does is that switches the right answer. So now the data supports rash getting worse. Okay? And we should theoretically see exactly the same. We don't see exactly the same. They're a little bit more incorrect. We're not entirely certain why, but anyway, that's what they're reporting. Okay? Everybody with me? Okay, let's go next. Then we changed the framing of the problem. Right? So exactly the same numbers, but now we're talking about minimum wage laws, something that development professionals tend to have an opinion about, right? But yet the opinion is not settled. So there's still debates about this, right? And we're saying, look, please evaluate this study. Here's localities that increase the minimum wage and whether the income of the poorest fell or rose. And here's localities that did not increase the minimum wage. Okay? And we're just saying, tell us whether minimum wage laws were effective or not based on this data. Okay? If you go to the next slide, I'll show you when the data supports the good outcome that minimum wage laws were effective, a drop of 41%, exact same data, right? Good outcome, huge drop, and by the way, worse than chance. Yeah? Blows your mind? Blows my mind. If we go to the next slide, I switched the labels again. So now the data supports the other conclusion, right, that minimum wage laws are bad. And then if we go next to the next slide, again, a drop. A little bit more modest, but still a drop, pretty significant, of 10%, right? And in fact, we've got enough data to show that this 48% is lower than 50%. So it's lower than chance. Okay. Now, that in itself is just basically saying, look, changing this minimum wage laws makes people less good at evaluating this data. But here's one additional bit of evidence. We asked them in the survey later on, said, tell us a little bit about your political views. One of the questions was, do you believe income should be made more equal, or do you believe that inequality is good because it provides incentives for work? Okay? So greater numbers here on the x-axis mean higher preference for inequality. Now, when the data supports the good outcome, that minimum wage laws are effective, the more these people value inequality, the wronger they get. And we can look at the flip side of this, which is the next slide. It's a modest increase, but it's an increase nonetheless, going in the opposite direction. When the data supports a bad outcome, people that like income inequality tend to be more correct. This is, I'm going to skip over, these are just the details of the thing. If you're interested, we can talk about that later. Okay. So essentially what we find is more errors when we framed it in terms of the minimum wage, both in the World Bank and DFID. We see that. Statements of income inequality are correlated with these errors. And we take that as evidence of confirmation bias, that instead of actually engaging with the data, people are relying on their priors and giving us the wrong answer oftentimes. Okay. The second study I want to talk about is about framing. So this already had a little bit of flavor of framing on confirmation bias. The second one is actually having to do directly with frame and what we call loss aversion. And it's motivated, we're using a very old experiment with this. Next slide, please. But it's smack dab in the middle of the Ebola crisis. Now, I don't know if you guys remember the Ebola crisis, but there was a lot of pressure for the World Bank to actually do something. There's lots of pictures like this, scary guys in masks. It actually was an extremely bad event. In fact, about 2.8 billion in terms of losses, right? So pretty terrible. What we're asking them, this is another experiment, we're saying to some people, suppose your country is preparing for a new disease that is expected to infect 12,000 people. Okay? Scientists have come up with two treatments, treatment 1 and 2. If people take treatment 2, 4,000 people will be saved. If people take treatment 2, 1/3 probability that 12,000 will be saved, and 2,000 probability, 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. So what this is a safe policy or a risky policy. So I'm asking you to suggest a policy based on these results. Okay? And this is what happens. Under that frame, about 22% suggest the risky policy. So only about 22%. Okay? But then, in the next, for a separate group of people, I change the frame up. Right? So now, I frame it as a loss, which means new disease is supposed to infect 12,000 people, just like before. Treatment 1, 8,000 people will die. You already feel like that's different, right? Otherwise, in treatment 2, 1/3 probability that no one will die, and 2/3 probability that 12,000 people will die. Wait, the numbers might not be. Yeah, that's right. Now, the point about this was, in expectation, these are identical, right? So it's a matter of preference which one you like. Okay? But still, in both cases, there's a safe policy and a risky policy. This one, yeah. Right? Here again, treatment 1 is safe, treatment 2 is risky. Okay? So in the next slide, you'll see the results. And this is what we get. Right? An increase in the proportion of people prescribing the risky policy, right? From 22% to 65%, almost a mirror image, almost a flip, right? When you go from the gains frame to the losses frame. Right? So the way you couch this problem, right, can affect the type of policy people are selecting, right, or prescribing. Okay? Just out of curiosity, if you're curious, we did this with DFID and the World Bank. The numbers look almost identical. Okay? All right. As I mentioned to you, this is actually a pretty old experiment. We recycled it for this purpose, mainly because of the Ebola crisis. And we find exactly the same results, not significantly different than the study that was conducted over 40 years ago. Right? It's pretty crazy. Okay. Now, let me finally talk this last bit about bias mitigation. Okay, I'm going to be quick in this last bit, right? So we started thinking, okay, well, demonstrating these biases are fine, but now what do we do about them? We need to be able to do something. And so we started this research agenda, and just started it, so I'm just going to give you a flavor of this, about mitigation policies. Yeah? So there's lots of mitigation policies that people talked about when we showed them these results. I don't know if you're familiar with dog fooding. This comes from Amazon. It's about eating your own dog food, that producers should also be consumers of their own product. Yeah? Red teaming comes from the military, that you argue the other side. There's a blue team and a red team. Yeah? But typically the response always is more bureaucracy. Right? The bureaucrats tend to say that. Anyway. Sorry, I should be careful about this, what I say here. But anyway, so that's it, right? There's more of these sort of policy things. Now we thought deliberation might be a good one to test, right? In a simple framework, and that's what we did. So we're taking the experiments I showed you before, okay, and we're going to run it with a small sample of DFID economists. Yeah? This is my co-author, Stefan Durkan. He's, I think, presenting here. This picture's from here. A few years ago. He's also a big fan of martial arts. I don't know if you knew that. If you go to the next slide, you'll see him in action. Here's some action shots of him. Let's go to the next slide. So he implemented this next experiment, right? He's holding a retreat for DFID economists. In the morning, he's asking people to fill out the survey exactly like we saw before, just the minimum wage and the health one, okay? But then in the afternoon, after lunch, he hands them back to it again, and he says, look, pair up, right? And in pairs, give us the answer, okay? That's basically all he's doing. So the deliberation is very simple. It was individual in the morning and in a pair in the afternoon, okay? So first on confirmation bias, this is what the data looks like in the morning, right? So this is when people are making individual decisions. When the data supports a good outcome, 67%. Data supports bad outcome, 63%. You'll notice this is better than what I reported earlier. This is because this is just economists, so you expect them to be better at math. You hope that they will be, and in fact they are. And then in the next slide, with deliberation in the afternoon, an increase in accuracy on both sides. Yeah? Now, there's some caveats here. It's a small sample. It's also, they've seen it twice, so it could be learning. We don't actually discuss that. This is the first cut at this. But in any case, if you squint and just go with it, you see that things seem to be improving. Yeah? At least in this situation where there is a right answer. Now in the framing example, there wasn't a right answer. Yeah? Let's go to the next one. Next one again. So here in the morning, this is what things look like. For the gains frame, 33% are prescribing the risky policy. For the losses, 50%, similar to what we had before. When we do this with deliberation, what we should see if deliberation is working is a reduction in the distance between 33 and 50%, right? That they should become more consistent. in fact, that's not what we see. In fact, the distance actually holds. Right? So what we conclude from this is that a deliberation had some effect in certain types of settings, but not in other types of settings. In particular, we think that this is because this prescription is more of a judgment call, whereas the other one had a clear right answer. Okay, so here's the overall conclusions. We find some evidence for biases in decision-making in a sample of policy professionals. This is very concerning for us because we expect or we hope that the advice that we're getting is coming from a broad evaluation of the literature, and potentially the fact that it's not is a pretty massive issue. Right? And now even the other thing I want to show you is even with evidence-based policy making, right? Because one of these is also about interpreting data. And even in the interpretation of data, we can trip up. So we have to be careful. Okay? It may influence the type of projects selected for funding by development agencies. That's a big problem. There could be issues of what we call in the paper academic incest, right? That come from a certain type of school and then that infiltrates all of policy. So we have to be careful about that. And we find that deliberation helps sometimes. But there's a big research agenda to try and unpack more policies that can help us mitigate these biases. I'm going to conclude with the final slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharyar. Thanks to CDPR for organizing this. One really nice outcome that's already happened because of this forum is that I saw Sharyar's paper, which is very relevant to ours, which I hadn't seen before this, so I saw it last night. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to talk about constraints that decision makers face in making decisions. So some of it will be similar to the kinds of stuff that Sharyar was talking about, although much more kind of preliminary look at how they interpret data. The second thing that I'll talk about is when they are given evidence, how is it that they make decisions? If we could move to, so the setup essentially is the existence of this building, is the existence of development economics as it exists today. It's largely focused on impact evaluations and sort of figuring out what works and what doesn't work in development. So I'll just look at you for next because there's lots of nexts. Right, so for instance, the AEA's randomized controlled trial registry right now lists, as of last night, 1573 studies from 115 countries, right? So this is 1573 examples of randomized controlled trials in education. So let's look at a few examples. So this is looking at taxation. This project was run through in this building through SERP. That performance pay for tax inspectors increases revenue. In family planning, we have an example of how to raise contraception rates. If you offer it privately to women, not in front of their husbands, they're much more likely to take it up. We have examples from education, sort of counterintuitively. If you increase teacher pay, that does not in fact affect test scores at all. In crime, from Liberia, you have the example of if you offer cognitive behavioral therapy to at-risk young men, criminal behavior significantly gets reduced. So in all of this research, the underlying assumption among academics is that we can generate this evidence and then we can convey it in some form or the other to the policymaker, who can then incorporate it effectively into some sort of decision-making process, right? And so one constraint that we often recognize is that there is a political economy, right? That it may be the case that if we present the sort of the teacher pay increase result, but there's a political economy and it's sort of they have to increase the pay, they'll just do it anyway. The one thing that we don't often think about is when we actually go and give them the evidence, how do they in fact process it, right? So exactly the kind of thing that Sharyar was talking about, what are the biases that go into sort of incorporating the evidence in the first place? And then secondly, when they see the evidence, do they update their beliefs about certain quantities, certain realities in the ways that we would expect them to, right? As economists, as statisticians, we have certain theorems about how people should be updating their beliefs about how things are. When given evidence, do they actually do that? So what I'll present you today is sort of results from some surveys and experiments that we ran from sort of starting in November 2013 to about March or April 2016, with about 1,500 civil servants in Pakistan and about 100 civil servants in India. So this is some surveys that were run as part of some trainings, and then we also did some survey experiments. This is joint work with Michael Callan, Adnan Khan, and Asim Khwaja. They haven't seen sort of this presentation, so any sort of errors should be attributed to me. Yeah, so the first thing we do, and I'll thank Shahriyar for introducing this table. So the exact same numbers, we took it from the same, I think this is Kahan 2013 who used these numbers for the first time. So we didn't run an experiment. This is a simple survey question. We gave them this evidence about farmers using a new variety of seeds. And we said there are some farmers who use the new variety, some farmers who did not use the new variety. Next, and we asked them, well, which group of farmers do you think were more likely to see an increase in yield? Was it the farmers who did use the new variety or those who did not? And as Yar nicely explained, there's some sort of common ways of making errors, right? So you would compare this to this, you would compare this to this. You wouldn't actually calculate the percentage, which you ought to do to be able to get to the right result. And what we saw, so in Shahriyar's sample, you saw it ranged from 40% to 80%, is that right? The original, so the original sample was a sample of US adults, not policymakers. And there the accuracy rate was about 41%, less than chance. By chance, you would see 50%. What we saw was statistically indistinguishable from chance. So we saw a very, very close to 50% of the civil servants in Pakistan and India answer this question correctly, right? So in the first instance, this is confirmed that, similar to DFID and the World Bank and US adults, we see that Pakistani and Indian policymakers are making the similar kinds of errors. We also did a couple of other things I'll show you an example of. Can we go to the next one? So we showed them these graphs, which are unemployment rates for 3 districts for 3 years, right? So the first set is 2010, 2011, 2012. And we asked them a very simple question, which is, which district had the highest number of unemployed people in 2010? Right, so this is all the information you have. These are percentages. We didn't sort of make this very explicit in front of them. Can you go to the next? Right, so we simply asked which district had the highest number of unemployed people. And to our surprise, we found that, next, yeah. Only 14% of mid-career civil servants in Pakistan and 72% of group 4 respondents, which is sort of similar experience group in India, answered correctly. And the right response, of course, as everybody in this room understands, is that you cannot answer this question based on this data because these are simply percentages. You don't have any idea what the population of each district is, right? So only 14% of sort of civil servants with 10 years of experience in Pakistan who are extremely qualified looked at this graph and recognized that I cannot actually tell you which district had the highest number of unemployed people. So again, this was sort of surprising and shocking. I won't comment on what the difference between India and Pakistan represents. I think the sample from India is also kind of small, so I won't comment on that. So we also ran a bunch of other things that showed similar results, which is that sort of relatively simple evidence that we would expect sort of college graduates to understand, civil servants have trouble understanding. And so, as Yar said, this is different from a random sample of adults because these are people who are contractually obligated to sort of use data in a nice and accurate manner, and they are the people we depend on to make decisions in countries. So then we asked them sort of what sort of, we gave them a range of potential barriers that they face in their organizations. And so these range from, lots of different organizations, they're sort of different government departments, at the provincial level, at the federal level, and they could be in the foreign service, they could be in education departments, they could be in the DMG. And so we asked them, we gave them different sort of potential barriers, and we asked them to rate how much of a barrier they thought each of them was in making decisions. And the one thing that we typically focus on in research and sort of policy, in the policy world, which is just getting the research out there. Very few rated that as a big barrier, right? So dissemination alone is not a barrier that is seen by the policymaker. They didn't say, oh, I wanted to make a really nice policy decision about education, but I just couldn't find the right studies. That's not what they're saying. What they are saying is that their departments lack the capacity to organize and analyze data, right? So this is, those of us who work with government departments sort of encounter this problem on a regular basis, which is that they don't have the right human sort of resources and sometimes also the technical resources. They also said often that decisions have to be made far too quickly for us to be able to use data. The CM asks for a decision tomorrow, we have to take a decision tomorrow, we don't have time to read studies. And then the third thing is the institutional structures sort of reward the status quo, right? So this is something they said often, which is that if you go to the next slide, these are examples of sort of quotes they gave us. So they said people at the top are not interested in evidence. They want things done their way irrespective of the outcome, right? So I have to listen to my boss. And if my boss or I go against the status quo, I have to justify it to a far greater degree than if I just simply go along with, I did this because it happened last year. Next. And then this is also something we often see, which is institutions are sort of silos. There's echo chambers within institutions. People don't listen, go outside institutions. There's very little cross-institution collaboration. Go to the next. And then from India, we have an example, which is, which could have been from Pakistan, which is that there is a general sort of lethargy or apathy. There's an inertia to change to bring improvement in the existing system, right? So these are things that they're saying about why it's hard for them to use evidence. Now I'll present a series of sort of experiments in a very simple way. And so this is, what we're doing here is we're presenting them with different evidence and we're asking them to make decisions, right? And so we're saying, how do different kinds of evidence impact the decision they make? So the first thing we did was that we presented policymakers with policy proposals in various domains, right? So this ranged from education. So we said test scores are low, one way, teacher attendance is low. One way to solve this problem is to send monitors to school, to do school monitoring. We also talked about sort of tariff reductions to increase revenues. We talked about a total of 8 different proposals. And then we asked them the extent to which they supported a particular policy, right? But then along with the policy, in some of the cases, we gave them hard evidence, which means we gave them a representative sample or the results of an RCT. Right, so this is evidence that economists would say is sort of good evidence, is based on numbers, it has statistical rigor. To some of them, we gave them soft evidence, which was simply an anecdote, right? So in the case of the school monitoring example, it was sort of a testimonial from a parent, which said something like, my kid's school was not functioning well, the teacher wouldn't show up, but then these monitors would come, and then I feel like my kid is now learning better. So I think this is a soft evidence. And there was some sort of as a control condition, we didn't present any evidence. And so we wanted to see in the different conditions, how did support for the policy changed? And so what we found, which was heartening, was that both kinds of evidence increased support for policies and hard evidence increased evidence significantly more so, right? So this is heartening in the overall sample. This means that our work is sort of, means something that, policymakers are listening to us. But the worrying thing is when you look at the different policies, so we find that there are policies, and this is kind of getting into what Shahryar was talking about, although we don't have a good test of the confirmation bias, which is that in certain policies, soft evidence actually mattered a lot more, right? So if you look at the school monitoring example that I'm talking about, the teacher's testimonial, the parent testimonial that I'm talking about, can you go, right? So for some policies, soft evidence mattered more. On school monitoring, the soft evidence increased support significantly more than the hard evidence. So they didn't care as much about the data, they cared a lot more about the story. In one example, we actually found that evidence decreased support for policies, right? So both hard and soft evidence decreased support for appointing specialists to lead government departments. And so anecdotally, again, this is not a test of how this response changes with respect to priors, but anecdotally speaking to a lot of these people, it was clear that they were very strongly head priors about whether specialists should head departments or generalists should head departments, right? So people who are familiar with the bureaucracy, there is a sort of famous DMG versus everybody else battle, and DMG believes that generalists can sort of head all departments. Most of the departments think that specialists should be heading departments. And so it could be the case that based on my own strongly held priors, as soon as I see some new evidence, I start finding all sorts of reasons to disprove it. And so being presented with evidence could actually reduce support for a certain policy compared to when there's no evidence. And so with that, then another sort of experiment we did was based around sort of just testing whether our focus on large end research, on sort of large surveys, on RCTs, is that something that gets translated into policy, right? So we produce lots and lots of large end evidence because you want to be right, because you believe in statistics, and so we want to have the right answer. But also because sort of we do have this belief that if we have a large enough sample, we'll be able to convince anyone, right? If I do a census of Pakistan and I have the right population numbers, people will believe me. And so to test whether policymakers actually get convinced by large N evidence compared to small N evidence, we ask them to estimate certain quantities that are sort of very relevant to policymaking. This includes things like in district X, what is the school completion rate, what is the immunization rate, et cetera. So we asked them this quantity, which they might or might not have reasons to know very accurately. But then we also gave them evidence from either a small sample, and so this is all hard evidence. So I'm not talking about any stories anymore. I'm just saying we did a random sample of either 25 households or 2,500 households. So this is all hard evidence that's either small sample, small n, or large n. And so what we found was they updated the belief significantly when given small sample evidence, to an extent that they should not. Any sample of 25 people from Lahore district should not really affect your beliefs about what the unemployment rate in Lahore district is, because it's too small a sample, right? So if you can apply a Bayes rule to it and figure out exactly how they should update, they updated far too much. Even more worryingly, they did not update any more when they gave them large N evidence, right? So the numbers were such that from a 2,500 sample, we were asking them in certain buckets. So like unemployment rate can be between 11 to 15%, let's say. When you get large N evidence, according to Bayes' rule, you should be 100% sure that the unemployment rate falls in this bucket, right? But their beliefs did not significantly change between the small N evidence and the large N evidence. So this is then a worrying sign that if our objective is to convince the policymaker, investing in N may not be the right approach. The other thing we do really well in development economics is that we focus on internal validity. So we take a certain area, right? So for instance, for those in this building, let's say the PO project or the tax project takes a certain number of districts, right? You take those districts and then you want to find an answer that's really right within those districts. And then there is the inherent sort of hope that policymakers from other areas will look at that research, right? So the tax paper was published in QJE. There is the hope that people in Zambia or India or Bangladesh will look at that research and then take some lessons from that research. Next. So to test that, what we did was, again, we similar methodology. We asked them to estimate those quantities. But now we're giving them evidence that's either, that's either small or large N, but it's also either local or non-local, right? So let's say we're asking them to estimate something about Rawalpindi, and we're giving them evidence, so it's either small N evidence from Rawalpindi, or it's small or large N evidence from Lahore, right? And we're asking them a question about Rawalpindi. And so the development economists' hope is that research from Lahore should, in some sense or the other, convince the policymaker in Rawalpindi, right? So the test really is the policymaker in Rawalpindi probably has access to some small N sample of their own, but if I gave them really good evidence from Lahore, that should update their priors more. What we find, though, is that the policymakers' priors update significantly more when given small and local evidence, right? So the Rawalpindi guy gets a small N evidence from Rawalpindi compared to large and non-local evidence, right? So the tax paper given to somebody in India would probably update their priors less compared to small N evidence from India itself, right? So this is not to say that this is something they ought or ought not to be doing. This is, so in economics we sort of deal with this problem of how do we convince people, or how do we think about generalizability, right? So we do a survey in Lahore. Is it the case that we should be extrapolating to Peshawar or not? That's the question that is an open question in economics. All I'm saying here is the policymaker doesn't believe our story. The policymaker doesn't think that large N evidence from other areas is very relevant to them. And so what does all of this sort of lead us to? So the first thing is policymakers have trouble understanding evidence, sort of not more so than the US adult or more so than the World Bank expert, but the policymaker in Pakistan and India has trouble understanding evidence. And then secondly, contrary to our priors, I believe access to evidence is not the major constraint. The major constraint is more sort of structural organizational incentives. And then when we go to thinking about what kind of evidence changes people's priors, so hard evidence mostly works, right? So that is reassuring. But there are certain hard cases, right? So critical cases where strong priors exist, and in those cases, stories may work better, or evidence may actually have a negative impact. So if our objective is to gather evidence and convince policymakers, we need to do more work on figuring out what people's priors are so that we then present evidence to them in the right way, right? So in certain cases, stories may be working better than evidence, right? So you gather some evidence, then you figure out how do I next go on to convince the policymaker. Next. And then finally, that our sort of enthusiasm for large samples and internal validity is not shared by the policymakers, right? So obviously, for the sake of being right, we have certain methodologies, we should keep on doing that stuff. But to the next stage of policymaking, which is actually convincing the policymaker, we need to do a lot more work in figuring out how to translate these things. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had two very interesting papers. I mean, in some sense, this notion of impartial and objective decision making has at the base of this, the thinking that if you produce good quality evidence and you put it in front of a decision maker, you instill a eureka moment and the correct decision is reached. I think what these two papers have done is they're basically saying that way of thinking about how do you reach impartial decision making is actually much more complex. So there are a number of challenges, from the simplest challenge that reading evidence is something that may not be easy for decision makers. So that's the kind of most trivial kind of point. To the more complex problem of what Sharia talked about, which is confirmation bias. That I have basically strong views about what should happen. And then, I start seeking out evidence selectively. But I think that there is a third part to it, which is, we're seeing in the world today, which is the world of false narratives, that you can use, you can construct kind of, in some sense, evidence and force decision making. So we're very lucky to have Silvan Sadiq sir, who grappled with these things at various levels. And be great to hear from him, what his kind of journey was when it came to reaching impartial and objective decision making and dealing with evidence as a policymaker.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all what has been presented is most interesting, and at various stages of one's career, one has confronted this question: how do you bring about a change? Because obviously there is a status quo in whatever sector, whatever field, whatever walk of life, there is a given. And that is whether that should continue, whether you should move forward, whether it is education, health, other social sectors, the economy, which is the best way, security, defense. And you see, unfortunately, we were not specialist civil servants. We were the products of a notification. If the notification said today you're going to go and work in the defense ministry, that you did that. Tomorrow you were brought to finance or to the economic affairs or to agriculture, education, health, you name it, you circulated. So, in essence, what you present here can be taken at two levels. Obviously, there is the academic. And I consider myself fortunate that, and most of us who are civil servants, did go to a school, did go to a college, did go to a university, and they were academics. And they were academics, and they were academics. Some, of course, influenced you. They were larger than life figures, and their conduct, the way they spoke, the way they addressed a problem, in whatever field. I'm not saying whether the subject had to be economics or political science or history or philosophy or psychology or English literature or history, whatever. I mean, all the social sciences, an area I was lucky to be familiar with over the number of years. There were people who influenced you. And that is perhaps what forced you or made you think inwardly and try to change for the better. What should you be reading? How should that be affecting you? Whether whatever you read is to be put aside and you go on your own merry way, or will that impact you towards what life is all about? I mean, these are all, so you are not dealing here with a group of people who are morons or idiots. You're dealing with people who perhaps could have gone to the academic side also, were good enough, but chose to be here in the civil services. And I think by and large, each one, it was not simply a profession, it was basically trying to be recognized at a personal level, but also to be able to deliver, to do something. And you were perhaps what one may call, in the language of the Bible, the chosen ones. But then you came across another layer which was going to decide matters. And that layer was either familiar to you because of your own family background. You came from a family background where there were politicians around, and you could see, and perhaps you also imbibed the same values, perhaps discarding them as you went along your educational path. But at least you could understand their position. Or you could be somebody who was totally in an urbane environment, had no experience of what rusticity brought with itself culturally by way of the social linkages and the bondings and the bondages and the expectations which that rusticity or that cultural rusticity would bring. And even in certain urban areas where the concept of muhalladari, the bradri, the being of the same clan, etc., would bring to bear upon you when you became a civil servant. Now, it's all very easy to say that I have never taken money to do a piece of work. That is one part of it. Let's put it aside. But if you pose this question to you, whether I always worked with the degree of intellectual honesty which I should have, the answer would be perhaps 50-50, 75-25, 80-20, 40-60, whatever. It will not be 100%. And that is the inherent bias when you put it into a more academic setting. But these biases are germane to any level of decision making. Whether it is the civil servants or whether it is the political leaders who ultimately say yes or no, whether they understand the entire implication or not is a totally different ball game. And Ali Chima, with whom I had the pleasure of working, and then Mr. Nadeem al-Haq, Dr. Nadeem al-Haq, who's here, was our senior in school, had worked very closely when he was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. And I, being his junior, he would share his frustrations with me that, Silvan Saab, why don't these people listen? Why don't these people listen? Isn't it so very obvious? And since I had more grey hair at the time than what Dr. Nadeem has now, it was my job with him and with Mr. Shahid Kardar and even with our minister, Dr. Hafiz Sheikh, to be putting some rustic sense into them that, look, life in Pakistan is like that, so don't take these things to heart. Please move along, keep on doing your bit. But this is a real issue. And what you call as a bias, to me, is a limitation. It's a limitation of birth. It's a limitation of education. It is a limitation of how you have evolved in the environment which you have faced. And obviously, it's also a question of your own self-interest. Now, in different times, civil servants have behaved differently. There was a time when they had a much larger canvas to play with. And of course, those were the times when you called the civil servants as the harbingers of change. Perhaps those were the civil servants who dealt with the economy, who decided whether Pakistan should be self-reliant, whether we should be an import-oriented country, or whether should we go for import substitution. And they would even put up factories and so on and so forth, and then pass on the keys to the private sector to run it more efficiently, because there was this realization that perhaps you could set up all this, but a day-to-day running required a business entrepreneurship, which of course was lacking. Now, it was that kind of understanding at that level which perhaps made Pakistan grow, not simply economically, but also strides were made on the social side. And I'm not talking of the politics, whether it was a military-controlled leadership or a so-called democratically elected leadership, because my theory has always been that Pakistan has just seen one continuity, and that continuity is an elitist continuity. Go back to 1935, and Shahid is here, and he's always been prodding me during golf and not allowing me to concentrate, but he's always been asking this question that do you feel there is any change? There is no change, at least to me. In 1935, you had the Government of India Act. In 1937, you had the state elections, and the Muslim League got a beating. There's only one person who was able to get himself elected, that was Mia Barkat Ali. And then comes 1940, and you have the much touted Pakistan resolution, and all of us who've studied in Pakistan are taught about the importance of the 1940 resolution. This was the pathway to Pakistan, and we have a monument here in Lahore, and we celebrated the 23rd of March, etc., etc., etc. What we are not taught in our history books is that 1940 was also the year of the Sikandar Jinnah Pact, when the Qaid-e-Azam entered into a formal pact with the unionist leader, Sir Sikandar Hayat, and that paved the way for gaining that entire unionist support for the cause of the country, for the cause of Pakistan. And in 1946, you have again the state elections, and Muslim League wins by a thumping majority. But who are the faces? The faces are the same. Sir Fazl Husains and the Khizr Hayats and so on, so the Mamdouds and the Timonis. And Pakistan has this checkered political history because, you see, you cannot dissociate all what you do in a lab experiment from this cacophony of politics and economics and culture and psychology and this and that and self-interest. All this is a part of the pot. And you have to deal with all of this. So that is why when people say that we lack an ideology, we don't have a policy, we don't have a vision, and we don't have this, the impossibility of having something concrete in Pakistan is manifest by its very variety. So anyone who wants to tread that path, unless has that kind of a brute force in his hand where he can club everybody down, otherwise a child born as a Pathan is going to go back to his roots, somebody born in Punjab will have his roots here, Sindh will have his roots there, and that is the reality. So let's accept this diversity. And this diversity is also manifest at the micro level of policy making and also at the macro level of policy making. So people like Dr. Nadeem ul-Haq will always be frustrated because the way they have seen things done was in a different environment where if something was proven to have value, and even though we all take it with a pinch of salt that fine, there's evidence, but yet it is current evidence. Perhaps the calculation could be wrong, and the understanding may not be there, or perhaps somewhere down the road you could come up with a new piece of evidence which would perhaps change the entire configuration. Yet, what we have now come down to is the security paradigm. And there was one slide which showed a very poor result for the top civil servants. I tell you that is absolutely true, and that has been my experience of Malaysia also, where one thought that the middle level officers were absolutely outstanding. The top was as idiotic and as stupid as we were. The reason for that, in my view, that we are gone into a protective shell. One would not wish to stick your neck out. Now you see, to bring about any change, somebody has to be upfront as the leader. But if you do that, A, you develop acrimony from within your own ranks, and B, failure is then a guillotine. So that is why most of us would really try to push it to the top executive. Make him buy something in such an insidious way that he thinks that he is now championing that reform. It serves two purposes. It actually absolves the person who's really the perpetrator of that reform from any reprisals should things go wrong, because the man is not going to hang himself. And also, if it is right, then since I am not a candidate for an election, it does him a lot of good, and also it sends out a message that this is what the top man wants, and we would obviously want to be on the right side of the top man, be in his lap, sleep with him if necessary. That is perhaps. But you see, these realities are generic. These cannot change, and these must be kept in mind. And the funny side of life apart, I think whether it is an academic dealing with public policy, or whether it is a civil servant dealing with public policy, or a politician dealing with public policy, whether with understanding or lack of understanding or limited understanding, they all run a very high risk. Because whatever they do is not going to perhaps affect them in such a manner as it is going to affect the large populace. And it is their lives, of the large majority, which is going to be affected. So, I can understand why the focus of the current Punjab government or the federal government is on developing infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't bite you back. But suppose there was a policy framework and you said that, okay, it is a part of my vision that 20 years down the road, every child in a public government school or a public school is going to have the same standard of education as a grammar school or the TNS Beacon House. Do you think somebody would even dare share this vision? He will not. Because the risk of that backfiring is too huge. And there are too many people who are going to be directly affected. So even though somebody may harbor that notion, and I try to instill it in the current leadership, they're not willing to buy it. But somebody who was perhaps not even schooled in the proper sense, who sort of chose to have people around him and listen to them, I'm talking of Joy Parvez Lai, would keep on asking you questions at night, repeat papers which Dr. Ali Chima would have written, or Dr. Salman Shah, or Shahid Kardar. But by simply asking that question and by then being ready to listen in whatever colloquial or proverbial or whatever language, because the point was to make him understand the importance of all this. And then his buying that ownership and gaining in confidence, no, this is the right thing. And this is the path to tread. Otherwise, why give stipends to girls in districts who attended school 80% of the time? I mean, it was not something which came to him naturally. But it was the usefulness. And of course, linked to it was the issue of his own election, of his own perpetuity. Every politician would want that. Every political party would want that. The point which I am trying to make is that all this work is very important, because without this, we would be left high and dry. Because times will keep on changing. There will be new knowledge which is going to be added to the blocks, the new ways of thinking, and so on and so forth. And yet, if we do not have this, access to all this, our ability to be able to influence the leadership, to be able to buy a certain reform path, will be limited to that extent. So I think I'll leave my comments at this level, and perhaps once you start asking questions, we can go more about it. Thank you.
So, thank you. I think what we can do is we can take some bunch of questions. So the floor is open. G. So if you could just introduce yourself.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Namira Hamid. I've been working in Punjab government for the last 3 years with Chairman P&D Jan Zeb Khan, one of the very few people who care about using data in policy making and decision making. And something I think with Asad, we've had a very brief conversation about this before, but I'll have two quick questions. One would be, was the study that was done by your team, was that before, during, or after the training that has been going on with the civil servants at NSPP? Because I think that was before? Okay. And then the other would be, I think, in one of the articles that have come out from your team is there a decision on using hard data and hard evidence and soft evidence both now for the policymakers? Because I think your presentation makes a very clear case for it. If the hard data isn't, or hard evidence isn't very strong, maybe then, couple it up with the soft evidence. So I just wanted to hear from you if there is a decision on that.
Assalamu alaikum ji, I'm Sara and Ahmed, and I have this question as a development professional actually, that on one side we've been presented with the academic reality of decision making and the biases that persist, and on the other side we've been presented by sheer experience and the system that prevails. So I guess I have a question towards Mr. Silvan Sadiq actually, that what do you recommend for the budding decision makers of today, if this is such an entrenched power system that one is to traverse, how do we start making the change without feeling that our necks will roll?
Hi, my name is Temur. I work upstairs at Excerpt. So I have two questions, both fairly interlinked. But my question is, so when you talk about biases and policymakers not accepting the evidence you put forward to them, how much does their prior experience with academic evidence matter? You can imagine policymakers saying that, okay, economists provided us with this and this evidence in the past, it hasn't worked out for us, why should we trust you again? And then linked to this would also be the aspect of how much do academics and policymakers have to lose when they make wrong decisions. It's about hedging risks. Their risks are hedged to society. If something goes wrong, they sort of walk away with their careers intact in most cases. Not in Pakistan, just a general sort of outlook. Nassim Taleb has a book on skin in the game, how it's important for policymakers and academics to have their own skin in the game. They can't publish research and then 30 years later be wrong and then still walk away with their Nobel Prizes and so on and so forth. So for academics and policymakers both, how much is a question of their personal risk and their sort of careers or their lives being associated to the decisions they take or do not choose to take?
I just had a quick question, sort of following what Namira said. I mean, I think one of the presentations also mentioned that, like, in terms of biases, there's also an element of an academic bias. There are a lot of different academic thoughts that are coming. So as a policymaker or somebody who's working in the government, you also have that element of which camp are you going to believe and which evidence you're going to use. But I think one of the larger questions, and I think I think academics should sort of look at this, is in the government right now, a lot of different departments are using evidence, but there's a question of, is my evidence the same evidence that you're referring to? They're clearly making decisions keeping something in mind. Just because it might be a little different than what your papers would be referring to, does that make it inaccurate or is false?
Can we come back to you in the show?
All right, go with the hard and soft evidence. Let's go with this.
The first question, so the study was before the training for obvious reason that we didn't want to train them in using statistics before asking these questions. And then, so the decision on whether we want to use soft versus hard evidence, so that's an individual decision for researchers to make, right? So in this building, we have 3 different organizations that use sort of different methods to reach policymakers, to talk to them. And so in some sense, it's the approach that each individual researcher takes, right? So my personal sort of effort is that when you're engaging with the policymaker, you have to figure out the policymaker themselves and then figure out what it takes to persuade them, right? And it takes different things to persuade different people, right? So the first thing is to be able, to convince yourself that something does work or doesn't work. And the second thing is what kind of thing works for that person, right? So then in terms of training, the BQ trainings use sort of, train people in how to use statistics. That's the main thing. Because, there's no training simultaneously to how to sort of use stories because that's sort of more intuitive. But then when actually you sort of figure out how are you going to convince a policymaker, I think my personal effort is to figure out each policymakers and then do what works with them. The second question was, I think, more for Shahryar. And then one final question that the final question that I think I can sort of allude to, which is thinking about sort of different data sources and how they vary. So that's so something that I didn't present. That was also one common constraint that people gave us against sort of the use of evidence, which is that we don't believe some of the data that comes in through the system for XYZ reasons because it's been proven to be wrong, etc. And so I think with the in the education sector, for instance, there's data coming in from different sources, and then people have an inclination to believe data from certain sources. So that speaks to the kind of confirmation bias. If I want to believe something, I'll believe the good data source from my perspective. If I don't want to believe something, I'll believe the bad data source. But the drive should be towards sort of authenticity, right? So to be able to convince people that there is a certain methodology, I think we also tend to believe we tend to not worry too much about methodology often as policymakers, right? So as part of these trainings, if we can figure out how to sort of get people to ask the right questions about the methodology, then we might be able to do a better job of sort of distinguishing between different kinds of evidence. I was very surprised sort of in a recent conversation with a politician in which they asked me about confidence intervals, right? So that was very surprising. Maybe somebody should talk to them about, you should ask them about sample sizes and confidence intervals before believing them. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. Let me just turn that. Okay, so thank you for some really insightful questions. Actually, if I may take your questions, the thing about prior experience. So what I didn't have time to show you was we were interested in whether, for example, for confirmation bias, whether people that work on poverty were reacting any differently from people that weren't working on poverty, or with people with PhDs. Turns out at the World Bank, you tend to have a lot of them. Whether they were any better or worse and so on. So we found no differences, right? So I can kind of say that prior experience, at least for this kind of study, right, was not really changing the results any. Now, whether or not, I mean, one thing that you can say, which you actually did point out, is, okay, yeah, so you ran this dinky little survey, what the heck did they have to lose by answering incorrectly? And that's actually a fair point, right? So it may be that in people's decisions, right, there's different levels of evidence that they use that we don't necessarily capture through our silly little academic exercises. And that's perfectly fine, but I think, I mean, that points to us starting to, collect more data in that respect, right? My response to that would be that, look, we need to start systematically looking at things, looking at decisions in more scrutiny and trying to look at people's experiences and where they're coming from, as well as what decisions they make and whether they were right or not. I think in the public sector, the gentleman was saying, wrong decisions tend to get scrutinized a heck of a lot, right? If things turn out to be bad, and if things turn out to be good, nobody's really touching that all that much. But I think we need evidence on both sides to try and understand why things went wrong and why things went right.
But very quickly, what should the budding civil servants do? Look, there is no getting away that more and more you are living in a knowledge-driven world. And the more evidence you can access, the more evidence you can evaluate and analyze, the better it is. I'm really interested in, and it may give a lot of satisfaction to you that you've done a very good day's work. But at the end of the day, this must translate into something positive. Because if it doesn't, then it's going to add to your frustration. And we as civil servants are trained to be very thick-skinned, take a huge amount of knocks, but yet enough is enough at times, and one starts feeling that, okay, I should quit and so on and so forth. My advice is really to the people who manage you, who are the ones who are going to present that to the chief ministers, to the prime ministers, to the ministers, and so on and so forth. How is that going to be presented? Now, if it does not sync with their political needs and aspirations, whatever good work has been done, please say goodbye to it, because he's not going to buy it. He'll only buy it if there is self-interest. Now you see, and that is why I said accept this reality of bias and work through it and across it or over it or whatever you need to do. So that is the test of you as civil servants. So to me, this has always been a great partnership. The academic doing all the research, because you're never going to have that kind of luxury of time to be able to do that. But you must be abreast of all what is going on. Have the ability to pass it on to the superior, who is the one who's actually, or wait for the time when you're going to be in that position and not unlearn what you have learned as a deputy secretary or perhaps as an additional secretary at a provincial level. And then be able to influence policy. And you're going to influence policy because the chief minister is the signatory, the prime minister is the signatory, the cabinet is the signatory. There's going to be a write-off. So it is getting them done, that is the challenge. So it's not simply good work, it's also developing perhaps a superhuman kind of a quality to be able to control the politicians. So unless you understand them, understand how they think, develop their confidence, here is something which is going to be good for us, things are never going to move forward.
I think all three presentations were excellent, but let me just quickly say, evidence, I don't think we can sort of conclude from this that civil servants don't choose evidence or have not used evidence. I think quite frankly, evidence has been used by civil servants through history virtually. If you think about all the systems that they set up through history, the development work that has been done by the civil service of India, Pakistan, whatever, there's been a tremendous amount of evidence that they've generated, tremendous amount of work that they've done. In fact, go back to the time when the planning commission was set up, the whole process of cost-benefit analysis were developed for Pakistan by various people, and we used it very well, and we did a lot of good work. After that, I can count a number of places where lots of, for example, one thing that Salman Saab I discovered in my father's papers, I discovered a number of these old commission reports, and I'm happy to give them to you researchers. Please look at them. There's a lot of evidence. Another thing that I point out is, look at Ralph Brabanti's book, 1958. He actually points out, he's got a 2-volume book, a 700-page book or something, a huge book, I remember. It's still lying somewhere, it's out of print now. But he pointed out that there was research in the bureaucracy of Pakistan, 1947 to 58, just 10 years. 10 years, and he produced a huge amount of volume of research. So evidence is there. Now, second thing I'd say on evidence, for example, we followed every World Bank program. I argued this with the World Bank once. Guys, we followed every one of your advice. You came to us with evidence, we set up BISP. You came to us with evidence, we set up voucher program. You came to us with evidence, we set up this or that, etc. On the other side, go back to my old counterparts, the IMF. They came with evidence, we've done 30 programs. We followed every bit of evidence. We've done 30. Salman Saab has been a part of that. QG. We followed all the evidence. We've done all the bloody tax administrative reform program, etc. So I think we economists need to be a little humble and recognize, yes, the country has followed our advice and quite frankly not got to where it should get to. And then we pull out another bit of evidence and say, look, listen to this, or they take this methodology or whatever. I don't think it's about methodology or evidence. I think we need to be a little more humble about evidence too, because the evidence also is now, for example, McCloskey has one way of looking at evidence, Paul Kearney has another way of looking at evidence. There's tons of people who give different views. There's politics of evidence too, there's politics of this, that's it. Lance Pritchard, for example, is giving a talk today on randomized controlled experiments somewhere or the other. So yes, there's a lot of controversy even within economics and evidence. The second thing somebody mentioned, Talib. Another thing about evidence is that unfortunately the way all of us do econometrics, there are certain harsh assumptions there that we also must face. They are based, like you, the work that you presented, on individual biases. Those individual biases are there and well known, and we should take those into account. But as Salman well knows, in the civil service or in the government, my own individual knowledge or his individual knowledge is not going to carry anything. It's a system that works. And how does that system work? What have we done over the years? We've attenuated the system that used to make the decisions. We've attenuated the whole CDWP process, the whole ECC process, the cabinet. I mean, he's attended more cabinet meetings that I've attended, but if he can tell you all the problems that happen there. Another thing, we have killed research in the civil service of Pakistan. We have literally killed it thanks to certain economic sort of prognostications by the Fund Bank, etc., etc. Now the civil service of Pakistan does no research at all, which it used to in my father's day. Now it doesn't do any research at all. So we tend to come along and say, oh, these guys don't understand this, they don't do anything, because they can't answer back because they have no research departments. Finally, I just say very simply, I mean, what you're talking about, for example, we've dealt with the energy crisis in Mansa for the last 10 years, where we lost about 40% of GDP. What evidence do we need? What do we need to fix that energy crisis? I think that's a fundamental thing that we should look at. And there it's not about confirmation bias, it's not about doing another RCT or whatever. It's something else that we need, some other kind of research we need. And I think that's also very important research, important evidence that we must generate if this country has to survive. Thank you.
My question is for you. I just want to know, can you explain what actually is the method for measuring the support that they get, the bureaucrats show for hard or soft evidence or large N or small n? So I just wanted to know the method, and to Silvan Saab, just thank you for the reality check.
Yeah. Great. And there's a question earlier that I missed as well, but I think it speaks to this point that was beautifully made about the use of evidence. I mean, at the end of the day, academics have biases as well. We're not immune to that because we're human beings just like everybody else. We've been trained in a certain way. I used to think lab experiments were the most amazing thing in the world. I don't think that anymore. I think if you're honest with yourself, you know the limitations of different methodologies and you use all of these things. I think the bottom line is that there are ideas out there, but they need testing. Right? Regardless of where they come from, regardless of the source, if you hear an idea, it's worth testing. If you don't have the evidence for it out there, it's worth doing it yourself. But at the end of the day, that's, I think, what it comes down to, really. Because, I mean, at the end, we're all biased, and we come from different schools. We have different ideas that have been put into us by our people. Over time, we grow and grapple with them. Sometimes we find it easier to just accept it and keep churning stuff out. Other times we want to challenge it and do other things, right? But it's worth it for us as individual makers, decision makers, to engage with evidence and test ideas.
So absolutely agree on the point of academic bias. I feel like I often feel like the more time you spend in academia, the more entrenched your biases for certain kinds of preferring certain kinds of data, certain kinds of approaches towards gathering data, they become very entrenched to the point that sometimes you feel like this very experienced person is not seeing their biases anymore. So that's absolutely true. And I absolutely agree with Nadeem Saab, who said that evidence has been used for a long time. When we were doing this work, one thing that we struggled with a lot was defining what evidence means, right? So evidence means a lot of different things to different people. And so that's part of the motivation for why we try to test how different kinds of evidence changes people's beliefs, right? So soft evidence, which is a story, is also evidence, right? So this is, that's one thing that civil servants value a lot, which is I need some valuable insights from somebody on the ground. So they would call somebody up, they would call, let's say, a local police officer, a local school teacher, to get insights into the implementation of some program, right? That's a technique that we've seen people use often. And that's powerful, right? Because that person can give you a lot of insights that maybe survey data cannot, right? So evidence absolutely, is and will be used in a lot of ways. What we tried to do was to figure out how do they respond to different kinds of evidence, and if the objective is to convince policymakers, what kinds of evidence are used more. So there's no statement about what policymakers ought or ought not to be doing. It's what academics ought or ought not to be doing if they're academics or people in the policy space, what they ought or not to be doing if their objective is to convince policymakers. I won't try to defend how the government interacts with the World Bank or DFID. I'll leave that to Shariar maybe, because he has co-authors. But I do think that that's also a case of evidence being used in in a very political economy context, right? So evidence is being used, it comes attached with money. Evidence is not used if it goes against our foreign policy, et cetera, right? And then with regard to the system not producing research anymore, I think the status quo bias that we talked about, the disincentivization towards doing anything new, I feel like if there is sort of incentivization of innovation in the civil service that you do see in pockets now, that would really sort of help. And then finally, sort of talking about the method, I feel I'll do it very quickly because I think, I don't want to go into too much detail. So I talked about 3 different experiments. The first experiment was asking about support for different policies, right? So there we would simply did it on a scale of 0 to 100, right? So we explained what 0 means, which means you absolutely will never support this policy. 100 means that you will always, in all circumstances, support this policy, and 50 means X, Y, Z. So that was a scale. For the other 2 experiments, large and small n, and local versus non-local, we were actually asking them to estimate certain quantities. So we, for instance, said, what do you think is the unemployment rate in district Rawalpindi, for instance, right? But we did that in a fairly sort of complicated way where we asked them to give us a distribution of the responses, right? So we did like 3 different practice questions to test if they actually got it, which is that, what do you think is the probability that it's between 0 to 10%? What is the probability between 10 to 100%? And we actually incentivized them to provide this, for the economists in this room, we provided them with incentives to give us the right response. By giving them prizes, right? So basically they had 2 different levels of prizes. One was a small prize and one was a large prize. And the idea was that the more accurate their response is, the more likely they are to get the bigger prize, right? And so they really apparently cared about these Harvard mugs. So we do believe that the incentive worked. So that was the method for eliciting their beliefs.
Okay, lastly, Ji, I'll take the cue from what Dr. Nadeem al-Haq just said and use the example of energy. I think nobody in Pakistan would really need to be educated on what Pakistan should be doing or should have done with its energy sector. And we've interacted with the World Bank experts, with the Asian development experts, or with your local experts. Everybody said the same thing. What were they essentially saying? The jargon apart, what were they saying was that you need more electricity, and you need cheap electricity. And you also need assured electricity and not subject to seasonal variations and vagaries and so on and so forth. So that essentially was the outline of the policy. The point is, it is what we then try to do with it. If you look at the original minutes of the working group which had been created, not a part of it because I was in the Kashmir affairs and the northern areas at that time, but then when I became the finance secretary, I did have an opportunity to. It was a beautifully written document. It was subsequently endorsed by the economic advisory group or the council, which Mr. Tareen and with Dr. Hafiz Pasha chaired that, and there were other experts and so on and so forth. What did that minute say? It said that Pakistan needs quick electricity in small numbers, maximum 800 to 1200 megawatts, which can be done straight away through a rental power, which will be expensive, but needs to be done to get yourself a breather, back it up with an IPP, and then of course with the larger projects, which would gestate in about 5 to 7 years. Where did the policy go wrong? On the personal expectation level, it didn't limit itself to 800 megawatts. It went to 1500. It went to 1800. It went to 2400. It went to 3200. And it wasn't stopping. And that is when people said, hands up, we just can't work. And Mr. Tareen walks out. And you see, the point is that something which was essentially necessary for relieving things in the short term was, allow me to use the word, prostituted for personal gains. Everybody then wanted to have a part of the pie. Now that is something where those who could not take it sort of walked away. Give you another example. There came a situation when I, as the finance secretary, was going to be marginalized, and our very dear friend, Dr. Nadeem al-Haq, and Mr. Shahid Kardar, who was the governor of the State Bank, and Dr. Hafiz Sheikh were all very passionate. They said, if you go, we're going to go with you. Finally, I, being a civil servant, at least had seen it all, that civil servants are there for the axing. So when it took place, so we all congregated in Dr. Saab's room, and they were all going as if we are going to put in our resignation. And finally I stood up. I actually stood up and I said, look, I'm the junior most in this room, but in terms of grey hair and all, and so please listen to me. And I only used a Punjabi phrase, which perhaps Hafiz मैं क्या तानू सारे नू उसे तनख्वाह ते काम करना पड़ेगा. But what I said, look, the point is you can't ask for the moon. Incremental gains are also gains. So don't rock everything. You can't leave the world of Pakistan to the likes of Zardaris and so on and so forth. Each one of you has a responsibility. And those bashings and knockings and all are have to be accepted. Things cannot be hunky-dory. Classroom ke andar to mera matlab hai, the book doesn't bite back. The politicians do. Well, learn to live with it and try to create bypasses. Try to win their confidence and make them do what should be done and make them the owners of that policy, and also stand up and clap, what a brilliant person you are. Well, it does the job for this country. I don't mind him wearing whatever hat he wishes to or whatever crown. All right, thank you.
So I think there's coffee outside. Yes? Yes. So we can just congregate there. I just wanted to thank the speakers, Silvan Saab, and all of you for taking out time to discuss an important topic, but let's kind of move outside. Thank you.
Thank you.